I felt invisible at my grandson's gender reveal, but I hid my hurt and stayed cheerful all day. People often talk about the Dark Ages as if it were a distant time of ignorance and cruelty, but sometimes I look at our modern world and I think the real Dark Age is right now. There is a cold myth today that human worth is tied only to productivity and efficiency. When someone or something ages and loses its flawless, out-of-the-box utility, it is quickly and silently discarded. Society treats us as if we are made merely of our immediate usefulness, completely ignoring the soul, the sweat, and the time we invested in building the present. We discard human memory just as easily as we throw away old paper. I learned in the most painful way possible that the monumental value of the past is completely invisible to those who are always in a hurry. My name is Judith. I am 68 years old, and my hands are no longer as firm as they used to be. My joints ache deeply when the wind turns cold, and my skin carries the permanent map of an entire life of hard work. But in those tired hands, I held my greatest treasure. It was a yellow wool blanket. The fabric was already terribly faded by time. The edges bore the unmistakable marks of almost 3 decades of existence, and the texture, once incredibly soft, was now rustic and calloused. But every single thread of that wool had been washed, folded, and protected like a sacred relic. I would run my trembling fingers over a double stitch, intentionally made much thicker. On the bottom left edge, right there, hidden from the eyes of the world, was the beating heart of my story. I remember the night I finished weaving it as if it were yesterday. It was a miserable grey Tuesday in January of 1999. The town of Chillicothe was buried under the worst blizzard of the decade. The wind howled like a wounded animal and violently rattled the thin glass windows of the old community hospital. The heating system in my room had completely failed. When my son, David, was born, he did not cry right away. He was purple, shaking violently, far too small to withstand that bone-chilling ice. The nurses rushed around, but the hospital was overflowing, and there simply weren't enough extra blankets. My husband was not there to hold my hand. We had lost almost everything we owned in the harvest weeks before, and he was out on the treacherous roads, driving a cargo truck through the black ice, completely without sleep, just to ensure the bank wouldn't evict us when I was finally discharged. I was entirely alone. I was terrified. I was freezing to my very bones. I opened my battered suitcase and pulled out a skein of yellow wool that my own mother had left me before she passed. With my hands violently shaking and my teeth chattering uncontrollably, I began to knit. I spent 12 agonizing hours weaving in the pitch black of that freezing room. Every loop was a desperate prayer. Every knot was a plea to God for my little boy to survive the night. And when I finally wrapped him in that thick wool, his weak, breathless crying slowly calmed down. The pure heat of my desperation and my profound love saved him. From that day on, the blanket was kept safely tucked away in a cedar box, waiting patiently for the day a child of my child would need it. And that day finally arrived. 27 years later, I put on my absolute best dress, carefully combed my grey hair, and drove to my son's house to meet my newborn grandson, little Leo. The house David shared with his wife, Lauren, felt like it belonged on another planet. It was a massive modern construction, boasting minimalist architecture and filled with endless shades of cold grey, stark white, and brushed steel. There was not a single picture frame out of place, not a speck of dust, not even the comforting smell of home-cooked food. Everything smelled sharply of hospital-grade cleaning supplies and next-generation disinfectants. When I got to the massive front door, tightly holding my brown paper bag with the blanket inside, Lauren answered. She was wearing perfectly tailored practical clothes. Her hair was pulled back into an immaculate bun, and she had a wireless earpiece blinking in one ear. She smiled, but it was a fast, occupied smile. She looked at me and she said, "Judith, it is so good you are here. Could you please leave your shoes on the entry mat? The pediatrician asked us to be extremely careful with whatever we bring in from the street now that Leo is here." I smiled, trying my best to hide my overwhelming anxiety to see the baby, and I said, "Of course, my dear, I completely understand. I just came to bring a little something for him. Is David around?" She adjusted her earpiece, checking a digital monitor on her phone, and she said, "He is upstairs trying to get Leo to burp. Come on, you can go up." I walked up the floating glass and wood stairs. The baby's nursery felt like a cozy operating room. An expensive air purifier hummed softly in the corner, and glowing digital displays showed the exact humidity and temperature of the room. In the center, in a crib lined entirely with synthetic hypoallergenic fabrics, was my grandson. David turned and hugged me, carrying that beautiful, heavy exhaustion of a brand new father. I cried the moment I saw Leo's tiny face. It was then that I reached into my bag. With an almost religious reverence, I pulled out the yellow blanket. The rustic heavy wool contrasted violently with the clinical cold perfection of that modern room. The faded yellow seemed to scream in the middle of all that gray. I laid the fabric gently over the back of the nursing chair, and I looked at my son, tears welling in my eyes. I said, my voice thick with emotion, "I brought this for him, David. It was the exact blanket I wrapped you in on the day you were born. It's been tucked away all this time, just waiting for this very moment." David smiled widely. His eyes shone with sweet nostalgia as he reached out and touched the coarse wool. But right at that moment, Lauren walked into the room holding a vacuum-sealed pack of diapers. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes fell on the blanket, and her expression instantly shifted. There was no malice in her, I truly know that. But there was a clinical insensitivity, a terrifying modern blindness. She sighed heavily, shifting her weight, and she said, her voice so incredibly controlled and rational, "Judith, it is a very beautiful gesture, it really is, but this wool, it sheds far too many fibers. And look at it, the color is very yellowed from age. Leo's respiratory system is extremely fragile right now. We specifically bought hypoallergenic microfiber blankets with thermal control. We simply cannot risk using something so incredibly old, something that has gathered decades of dust right near his face. I felt a sharp lump form in my throat, but I tried to keep my composure. I stepped forward, and I said, my voice as gentle as I could manage, I washed it, Lauren, 3 times, by hand, with pure coconut soap. It is perfectly clean. This blanket protected David from the absolute worst winter this town has ever seen. But she just shook her head, looking impatient, and she said, I know, and we are very grateful. But medical recommendations have changed drastically in 27 years. David, can you please take that out to the hallway so it doesn't drop dust into the crib? I turned and looked at my son. I stared into his eyes, silently begging him to say something, to defend our shared history. But the sheer exhaustion of his sleepless nights and his desperate desire to avoid an argument with his wife spoke louder. David looked down at the floor, grabbed the blanket carelessly, folding it without an ounce of tenderness, and he said, It is probably better if we just leave it outside for now, Mom. I swallowed the crushing weight of my wounded dignity. I forced a smile. I told myself I was not going to ruin this beautiful day. But the real heartbreak didn't happen in that nursery. A few hours later, when the massive house fell into a rare, heavy silence, I slowly walked down the stairs to go to the kitchen for a glass of water. My throat felt like sandpaper. To get to the kitchen, I had to walk through the utility room. The space was immaculate, filled with glowing white machines. In the corner sat a large stainless steel trash can with an automatic sensor. The lid was jammed open. I casually glanced inside. My breath completely vanished. The entire world seemed to stop spinning for a horrifying second. Down at the very bottom of the trash can, mercilessly crushed underneath torn cardboard boxes, wet plastic wipe wrappers, empty ointment tubs, and soaked foul-smelling coffee grounds, was my yellow blanket. I didn't scream. I didn't make a single sound. The sheer shock ripped all the air from my lungs and turned my legs into lead. I dragged my feet toward the bin. That was not just a piece of old fabric being thrown away. That was the most terrifying night of my entire life. That was the agonizing sacrifice of an exhausted father on an icy road. Those were my tears. That was my motherly love, being treated as obsolete, useless rubble. It was the practical, silent, utterly devastating disposal of my life story. I looked around frantically, making absolutely sure they were still upstairs. Then I, a woman of almost 70 years, leaned over the garbage. I plunged my trembling, aching hands deep into the rotting organic waste and plastic. I grabbed the yellow blanket and pulled it out with all my remaining strength. It was filthy. It was covered in dark brown coffee stains and smelled like decay. I started frantically brushing the wet grounds off the wool with my bare hands, crying silently, my shoulders shaking. Every single tear that fell onto the wool felt like acid burning my skin. I pressed the wet, ruined blanket tightly against my chest, squeezing my eyes shut. I felt profoundly humiliated, yet consumed by a fierce, animalistic need to protect whatever was left of my dignity. Moving quickly, as silent as a ghost, I rushed to the coat rack in the hall. I shoved the stained blanket deep inside my travel bag and aggressively pulled on my winter coat. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and I called out to them. When Lauren and David appeared at the top railing, I stood perfectly straight, my chin held high, and I said, my voice cold and polite, "My dears, I am going home now." David looked incredibly confused. He hurried down a few steps and he said, "Already, Mom, but dinner is just about to come out of the oven." I looked right through him, hiding the devastating pain in my chest, and I said, "I have a terrible headache coming on. I really need to lie down. God bless you both." I walked out the door into the freezing wind before he could insist, carrying my broken heart in my bag. I wasn't there to see the fallout, but my son told me, through agonizing sobs, every single detail of what happened next. He told me that the silence I left behind was suffocating. Deeply confused, he turned to his wife and he said, "She was perfectly fine a minute ago. What on earth happened?" And Lauren, completely casually, wiping down a counter, said, "I don't know. Maybe she got a little upset because I was cleaning the hallway and I threw that old stained blanket in the trash. It was a sanitary risk for our son David. It is just a piece of old cloth. Let's not fight over it." David told me he froze completely. The blood turned to ice in his veins. He ran into the utility room. He violently ripped the lid off the trash can and dug through the plastic. The blanket wasn't there, and the horrifying realization hit him like a freight train. He knew instantly that I had seen it. He realized his own mother had dug her bare hands into his wife's garbage just to rescue her own past. A sickening wave of shame and absolute despair washed over him. He told me he didn't say a single word to Lauren. He just grabbed his car keys and bolted out the front door, driving like a madman through the dark, freezing streets to my house. When he arrived, my front door was unlocked, pushed slightly ajar. The house was completely dark, save for one yellowed reading lamp in the living room. In the dead center of the room, laying across my wooden coffee table, was the blanket. I had aggressively scrubbed the dirt out of it, but the wool was still damp from the water and my tears. David walked in silently. He slowly approached the table. He reached out and touched the wet wool, and it was then, paying real attention for the first time in his adult life, that he finally noticed the bottom left edge. There was a tiny tear in that thick double stitch, right where I had started to pull it apart before I gave up. Driven by a blind, desperate instinct, David dug his shaking fingers into the gap and yanked the thick thread. The heavy seam ripped open. From deep inside the double lining of the wool, a small, waterproof wax paper envelope slid out and dropped onto the wooden table. He told me his hands were shaking so violently he could barely tear the paper open. Inside he found a folded letter, its edges yellowed by time. It was written in my handwriting, dated January of 1999. He read the words out loud to the empty room, to my David. If you have found this and you are reading it, it means time has run its natural course and my hands are finally too weak to keep you warm. You were born on the absolute coldest night of the year. Your father could not be in this room with me. We had lost everything. We had to pay the mortgage on our home, and he had to take a trucking route right into the blizzard so we wouldn't starve. The heater in this hospital broke in the middle of the night. You were turning purple from the cold, so incredibly small, without even the strength to cry. I had absolutely no money in my purse. I had no way to give you the beautiful modern blankets the newspapers show. I only had my old wooden needles and this yellow wool that belonged to your grandmother. I knitted through the entire pitch-black night, with my fingers bleeding and my teeth violently chattering from the frost, terrified out of my mind that I would lose you before the sun came up. With every single stitch I put into this wool, I poured all of my love, my youth, and my very own life, forced to heat your tiny body. And I sewed this letter here in the hem, with my eternal promise that you would never, in your entire life, feel cold in your soul. I sewed it hidden away because I know how quickly men forget where they came from when the world becomes too practical. Use this on your son, so that he knows that the love of a family is not disposable. It is the only thing that survives the crushing weight of time. I was standing quietly in the doorway of the bedroom, wearing my faded nightgown, when I saw my son's broad shoulders begin to shake violently. His tears fell completely out of control, splashing onto the ancient paper. He collapsed, falling hard to his knees right there on the hardwood floor. He grabbed the damp yellow blanket, buried his face deep into the wool, and he sobbed. He cried with the agonizing, chest-heaving pain of a man who realized he had almost let the greatest sacrifice of his life be shredded in a garbage truck. He looked up, saw me standing there, and he cried out, his voice completely broken. He said, "Forgive me, Mom. For the love of God, please forgive me. I didn't know. I didn't know. I let them treat your heart. I let them treat your pain like it was nothing but garbage. Please, Mom, forgive me." I walked over to him, my steps slow and deliberate. I didn't feel an ounce of anger. I didn't want revenge, and I didn't care about getting an apology from his wife. I just wanted my boy back. My knees ached terribly as I knelt down on the hard floor next to him. I opened my arms wide, and I wrapped them tightly around his shaking body. I pressed my cheek against his hair, holding him against my chest exactly the same way I did on the freezing night he was born. I whispered into his ear, letting my own warm tears wash over his face, and I said, "It is entirely okay, my sweet boy. You found it. You found it in the dark. That is the only thing that matters now. The real things in this world, the real love, it is never lost forever." I felt invisible at my grandson's gender reveal, but I hid my hurt and stayed cheerful all day. The very next morning, the bright winter sun poured into little Leo's immaculate high-tech nursery, but something in the room had profoundly changed. Standing quietly near the door was David's wife. Her eyes were terribly swollen and red. She'd cried bitterly, finally understanding the devastating weight of her own actions. She watched the scene unfold in absolute silence. Standing right next to the cutting-edge crib were my son and I. And there, draped with infinite care and tenderness over the legs of my sleeping grandson, keeping him perfectly warm, was the rustic yellow wool blanket. Lauren walked slowly across the room. She stopped right next to me. She didn't say a single word, but she gently reached out, squeezed my shoulder with a heartbreaking tenderness, and then she slowly rested her hand on the yellow wool. The silence in that room was no longer cold and clinical. It was the heavy, beautiful silence of profound respect. The value of our history had finally been found. The thread of our family had not been broken.